about evangelism. We're going to be wrapping up that series this weekend, but I want to continue to just keep our focus over the next weeks to hopefully engage you in that book that is being offered to the congregation called Evangelism. Cost you $5, cost us 10, so we're never really very good at that kind of thing. But if you recognize the purpose of why we're trying to just encourage, yeah, we do church, we don't do business. If you understand why we've been talking about it, again, we're really just trying to open up understanding. And as we do that, we talked a little bit the last time about how we don't want to make too much of the gospel and overwhelm people, and we don't want to make too little of it and undersell it, because in the sense that we want to be sure that people kind of are hear specifically that definition, if you will, because we really believe evangelism means that teaching the gospel with the aim to persuade. That's the way Stiles talked about it. And that word aim is important because we have a purpose in sharing. And one of the things that's important is to not only know what the gospel is that we're sharing, but why we're doing it. And the reality of why the aim really is that you can boil people down, when you think of it in kingdom terms, into two categories. I like the way David says it rather than Stiles, because David says those who know Jesus and those who still need to know him. Stiles says those who are going to heaven and those who are going to eternal destruction. I don't recommend that necessarily in however, there are some people, believe me, who will not respond until they hear that. And so you never know how God wants you to do that. Trust His Spirit. But Stiles says very clearly there are four questions that we really are important to ask when we're dealing with the gospel. And he says, first of all, who is God? Secondly, why are we in this mess that we're in? Thirdly, what did Jesus do? And fourthly, how do we get back to God? And he boils it down to the words God, man, Christ, and response. So those of you who have taken our Journey to the Core class know the words as creation, destruction, rescue, response. All right? And those are good words for you to just kind of keep in mind and kind of pass over in your head. Because if we're going to define God, which is, he says, at the forefront of the gospel, we have to know that he indeed is the creator. He is the one who is loving. He is the one who is holy. He is the one who's just. And he will execute perfect justice over all things and in all things, because that's who he is, but especially against sin. So that is an important definition, very simplified, but in very simple terms, that's the God with whom we have to do. And as has been said over and over, if there is a God, then we are accountable to him. If there is a creator that is greater, that created all of us, then we are accountable to him. Second part of it, obviously, man. Man is made in God's image. And I think this is always important, because one of the reasons why people can do great things, people can contribute in wonderful ways, is because we're made in God's image. We're made to display the glory of God. And so people need to hear that we are people who have great potential. We have great value in carrying that image. The problem is that image has been tainted because of our sin. And so with that, man has turned from being a child to being an enemy of God. And especially when we define sin, it's not necessarily just what we do, but what we are. We are born into it. I was conceived in sin, David said. Right? And that's what all of us have to grapple with. And hopefully you understand that, because that leaves you helpless before God, and that is why we need Christ. And the very purpose of that the Son of God living a sinless life, so that one, he could pay the perfect penalty. He would be the only perfect sacrifice to satisfy the justice of God, but at the same time to be the one who could redeem us, mankind. So he had to be fully God, but he also had to be fully man to be able to do that. And so that ransom comes from him. And Christ's resurrection is really the vindication, the ultimate vindication of the truth of that claim, that he could do that. Response is God's, again, God wants us to respond to him. And how do we respond to him? We respond in faith, simply acknowledging our sinfulness, not just acknowledging that we did something, but acknowledging that we are sinners by nature, and repenting, turning from that, and following him. So those are really just very basic things, but the very core of what we need to recognize. Again, as I said at the beginning, it's the aim of this that's important, because we're not just giving data transfer. We're not just kind of blindly sharing some facts with people. We need to remember that our aim is to rescue, in a sense, or at least to make clear that God has provided a rescue for us. And it's interesting because when Peter talked about always being able to make a defense, every time I read that verse, I always thought of it, okay, I have to defend myself. But I think you could just as easily look at that verse and say, I am trying to defend you. I am standing in defense of you, so that you recognize where you could be headed for eternal destruction, you could also be headed toward eternal glory. And so I prefer now, in my life anyway, to see that term, that be ready to make a defense, is not something that I have to somehow come up with all the right answers, because I fail at that. I put that pressure on myself, and all of a sudden somebody says, what kind of a God would do that? And I kind of go, you know, some of you have been in that situation. So my sense is that, and it was so funny because Rob and I were sitting in a hotel room a couple of nights ago, and just doing a little channel surfing, we came across an old episode of Bonanza. We both grew up watching that. Some of you have no idea what I'm talking about, but the show. That's like 7 years. I'm sitting, yeah, really. Park the dinosaur on we couldn't believe what we were hearing. They're talking to this guy who apparently his father was a preacher, and Ben Cartwright sitting at his bedside because the guy's kind of made a mess of his life, and Ben says to him, you know, you're not much like your dad. And he says, I know. And talks about how great a preacher his dad was. And then he had this moment where he was preaching the sermon, and he said everybody was full of the Spirit and responding. I'm listening to this on television. Full of the Spirit and responding, and everybody was a marvelous thing. And the Indians attacked, because it was an outside kind of thing, and killed his father, killed his mother, killed both of his brothers. And he looked at Ben Cartwright and said, what kind of God would allow that to happen? Now I'm thinking, this is public television, and they cut completely by me. Whether I saw that episode, I don't know. But you would never hear this discussion in television today. Ben Cartwright stood there silently, and the guy said, I suppose you're going to tell me God works in mysterious ways, we just need to have faith. And Ben Cartwright looks at him and says, that's exactly what I'm going to tell you. And the guy says, well, I can't believe it. He says, I see more of the devil in this than I see of God. Cartwright gets up, walks to the door, and he looks at him and says, how is it you can believe in the devil and you can't believe in God? And walks out. I wanted to go by every episode of Bonanza. I sat there stunned, thinking to myself, I never got this, I never heard it, and I'm probably just blind to it completely. But the very fact that they could have a theological discussion in the middle of this TV show that was so popular back in the 50s or whenever I was watching it, and okay, 60s, I'll take it. And I thought to myself, you know, this is where mankind has gone, to just kind of turning its back on that whole discussion. And yet, it fits in with my mind as what our aim is. Our aim is to persuade people. But there are moments where people can come back to you with that kind of thing. And the question is not necessarily going to be that you can answer all their questions.
Right.
The question is, are you willing to be able to represent even in that moment, you don't know the answer, but you know the God who has the answers. And in some cases, that's where faith is stretched. That's where faith is there. And can God use pain in those things? Absolutely. Absolutely. I sat with somebody today, and we talked about living in pain and living with all of those kinds of things. And can God use that? Does God have to have an answer to our pain? No. But he certainly can use it. Because it's not always about us. Sometimes it's about other people and how they respond to us in pain. Or how we can exhibit a strength of faith, even in the midst of what other people would look at and go, man, how do you put up with that? How do you deal with that? And you just say, well, I don't. I'm at my wit's end. But God does. And God helps me get up in the morning, and I just keep going, believing something else is going to happen. You know, I mean, those are the things that my hope is for you when you think of representing God in this world, that it continues to be pushed by that aim, and that aim is really just to persuade people to keep looking back to God, looking back to God, and understanding the fullness of it. So knowing creation, knowing destruction, knowing rescue, knowing response, knowing your own story and how those words would fit into your story, that's all you need to know. And then let God decide who you need to talk to. And the rest is there. It was funny because we sat, all the pastors were gone, and with our wives, and we were at this restaurant. And so when the waitress came up, and I said, you know, what David had asked us all to do, you know, we're gonna be praying for our food. Is there any way we can pray for you? Well, she was out to here with a child, and so I kind of knew she was going to ask, say, well, yeah, you can pray for my baby. And then I kind of wondered, she's going to go to the next table, they're going to say, you know, we're going to pray for her. They go to the next table, you know, we're going to pray for her. That's right. Overwhelmed with her.